This is Fresh Start Podcast. I'm Dave Henning, and today my guest is James Mulvany. And James, great to meet you in person. We've been working together for well over a year with my podcast .co that you have helped me arrange, and all the great work you've done. Your radio background. I'm a radio veteran, as you know. So thank you for being with me. Welcome.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about, especially in the area of serial entrepreneur. I've had my shot at doing a lot of different things, and as you well know, we have a certain risk tolerance, as they say in the insurance business, kind of a high risk tolerance for that matter, to try things, see what works, see what doesn't work, and you're going to get some results out of that. So, thank you for sharing. And today we want to talk about your background and now, is it true that you've never actually had a job?
Yeah, that's a weird sort of fact about me. I started when I was 16 years old, so my first foray into sort of making money online was my dad always had a business. Okay, when I was growing up, and he always said, the best thing he ever did was to start his own business. He had lots of jobs in his life before I was born, growing up. And then he kind of went into the antiques trade, and he just always said it was a really interesting, thing to do. And, he said it was just a breath of fresh air, just having that freedom, being able to come to, go to the kids' sports day or, pick us up from school. And, growing up, a lot of my friends had dads who were in the corporate world. They'd be going off to, London. They might not be back till 11 p.m. at night, so they wouldn't get to see the kids apart from the weekend. And I kind of just thought, my dad was just doing things differently, and it was kind of a big inspiration. So it was never expected upon me that I should start a business, but I suppose I was always encouraged to. So sure enough, when I was 16 years old, I managed to get a PayPal account, and I'd learned how to use Photoshop so I could do basic graphic design. And I kind of just started doing really odd jobs around the internet. I could pick up work on different forums, and I'd do, website design or design those little animated banners that you used to see that used to annoy you. And I kind of just took things from there, really.
That's fantastic. For some reason, comes to my mind, if you know about Russell Brunson up in Idaho, who started ClickFunnels. His first project was selling a potato gun online.
Right.
That shot potatoes, apparently. but he ended up creating this incredible sales funnel software, and so a lot of us have done a lot of different crazy and interesting things. What's the craziest thing that you've ever done?
Oh,
as far as marketing goes, not personally.
I don't know. That's a good question. We used to do. I used to share an office. Like when I was at university, I had an office, and I shared it with like 3 or 4 other businesses. And we used to do some pretty crazy stuff there. Those were the fun days. We were all starting out. A lot of us were just like working on our own, and we'd come up with these crazy ideas. So I'm just trying to think of some good examples. But we'd quite often just come up with some crazy ideas. And one afternoon I could give you a great example of something entrepreneurial that we did back then. We don't get much snow in England, okay? Occasionally you get one winter when it snows a lot, and that was one winter and it snowed like crazy. So we thought, okay, my friend had trouble getting his car out of the driveway, and you couldn't buy snow shovels or anything like that anywhere. They just, because I guess they didn't, it's not something that you can normally buy in shops over here because it's not needed. So we kind of decided as entrepreneurs that we'd set ourselves upon this task to find a manufacturer of snow shovels. So we ended up going across to this old industrial city in Yorkshire called Sheffield, which was like the heart of the steel industry for many years. And so there's still quite a lot of manufacturing going on around there. And we found a company who could actually produce these snow shovels. I can't remember where we went with it. I don't think we ended up buying any, but we actually visited the factory and like had a tour around and everything. And we thought, look, everyone needs a snow shovel right now, so we can make a load of money here. And it's just about like seizing the moment. How's that for a crazy story?
That's fantastic. I won't ask you what your ROI was.
I think we might have bought like 10 snow shovels, and then we ended up throwing them all away because, of course, the following day the snow melted.
Right. Right. That sounds like my winters in North Carolina. We'd get one
Yeah.
good day of snow, and they'd close the schools before the snow hit the ground.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So, well, now, and you also have a long history in the radio industry. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Yeah, I've been a big passion of mine for many years, radio, and we have a business called radio.Co, which powers thousands of different radio stations all over the world.
Is that your entire radio experience, or did you work for at one point local stations or maybe a university?
Yeah, so when I was growing up, I did hospital radio for a period. I did work experience for local radio stations, and I also DJ'd online. Just loved it as a medium. Growing up, I always used to listen to the radio. It's here to stay. There's been so many times over history where people have said, "Right, radio's on the down and it's going to die." TV first kind of hit the mainstream. They said video killed the radio star, but it never did. And I think radio is still as prominent and as interesting as ever.
We have similar background. I grew up in Rochester, New York, and at nighttime I could pick up the signal from a station in Chicago, rock and roll station. So ever since high school, I wanted to be a disc jockey, and ended up being involved in about 10 stations around the United States. And then I ran into radio.co, and that really got me connected and excited about jumping back into that career. And so, but today, let's talk about what is the story with, how did you come up with the idea of the Matchmaker FM at matchmaker.fm service,
Yeah.
which is, as you mentioned, a kind of a dating service for podcasters.
Yeah. Right. So there's lots of, podcasts have had this huge resurgence over the past couple of years, I think podcasts, if you said to someone 5 years ago, what's a podcast, you might get 50% people who would know what it was. Now everyone's listening to podcasts, especially in America, they've taken off big time, So, we were sort of launching podcast.co. I had a podcast about in 2008, 2009 for a period of time. So, I've been passionate about podcasting for a long time. And about 60% of podcasts are actually based on guests having, interviewing people. But there didn't seem to be one location where you could go and find out, find interesting minds to feature on your podcast. So if you're trying to build a specific narrative for your podcast, perhaps you want to interview an expert on, a very specific subject, or, you want someone who can kind of come in and provide sort of testimony for something you're trying to explain. I thought it would make sense to build a kind of, like a dating app almost. Like, this is how we've been billing it. It's like Tinder for podcasters, where, everyone who's on board is kind of interested in networking and wants to make great connections, and also is interested in telling stories and hearing other people's stories as well.
Yeah, and that is, as you mentioned, is just extremely popular to me, is to hear stories and real life situations, and it's actually more fascinating to me than fiction, quite frankly.
Yeah, I agree.
And I was listening to a gentleman yesterday on actually it was an industrial keynote speaker podcast. He had, and as a 9-year-old boy, he had set his garage on fire and ended up almost dying in the hospital. And he came out of that with an incredible story about being connected to the main broadcaster for the St. Louis Cardinals. And it was just captivating to hear what people have done in their lives, what they've come through, how it changed them, and his life mission and purpose. And I've made some great connections, by the way, just in my brief time with matchmaker.fm. And it's interesting to talk to different people with different backgrounds, and they're all excited about the service. Yeah. So how do you account for all that excitement?
That's a good question, David. I think, one of these things, it's been a surprise, and a fantastic surprise how many people have given us positive feedback. We've had so many people who have signed up, and within, say, 24 hours, 48 hours, they've already been, made some useful connections. And I think it's, it's a really exciting place to be for us as a company, and also massively, as an entrepreneur, I find it massively rewarding that, we're building these valuable connections. And, who knows where they'll go? Because sometimes you can meet someone on your podcast and then you'll end up either, potentially doing some kind of business deal with them, or they may become a client, or, may interviewing them for your podcast. So it's just, it's a bringing together of interesting minds. I think that's the way I like to see it.
I was quite fascinated with the gentleman that I spoke to right here in the Silicon Valley. That he's actually a venture capital guy, and that's how I kind of ran across you and what you're doing. And he was so interested and fascinated by it that I'm actually interviewing him in a couple of days about what he does here in a growth academy that he runs for startups. So very interesting. And you've had, now you mentioned also that you've had maybe just 20 ideas. That's all? You must have more than 20 ideas, but 5 of which really, really caught hold.
Yeah, so I think, I probably had more than 20. And it was interesting because I was having a conversation with someone earlier. I think in the early days, when you're starting out as an entrepreneur, and, for me, I went off to university and I used those 4 years to really kind of hone my craft and figure out, when I graduated, what was it I wanted to then go on and do? And I knew I wasn't going to go and work for anyone. But then I had a business that I'd built called Wave Streaming, which was similar to radio.co, similar kind of industry, slightly different product offering. But that was working, that was generating revenue. And, I was in a fortunate position that when I graduated, I could rely on that income and I didn't have to go and find a job. It was making enough that I could pay myself a salary when I graduated. And then a few short years later, I was, starting to scale and taking staff on board, etc. But, throughout that period of university, I used to come up with a new idea, probably especially the second half, I'd probably come up with a new idea every other week. But it can be really dangerous, I think, as an entrepreneur to go off on too many different tangents because, especially when you start getting something that's working, you start thinking, oh, well, could I do this with something else? And I used to register new domain names every other week, and I'd probably end up with 100 different domain names over the couple of years of ideas that, sometimes I started building them and they didn't really work out, or I just, it's a lot of it. Let's not be under any disillusion to launch an online product, especially now, even maybe more than then. And this was sort of 10, 12 years ago. It takes a lot of work. You need manpower, especially if you want to really, really kind of scale and make it big. And, it's great to sort of come up with ideas, but, ultimately it's the execution that's the most important. I know that catchphrase gets thrown around a lot. But I had all sorts of ideas back then, lots of crazy fun projects that I used to work on, and most of which never saw the light of day,
Yeah, we have that in common as well. I probably have registered lots of domain names, and I wouldn't do the auto renewal because I wanted to test them for 1 year before I decided to even keep the interesting, crazy, silly, applicable domain name. Yeah. So my challenge is, and put on your psychologist hat right now. My challenge is, I've always been a DIY guy. I want to do it myself. Nobody's going to do it like I can do it. And at what point did you realize that you needed to get some help, some people on your team to grow this fantastic project, the several ones that you're running right now?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a team that's about 30 strong in total, maybe just over now, maybe about 32, 33. And most of those are based here in Manchester in the UK. We do have a few, we've recently actually hired a few distributed folks. So we've got a guy in California, a guy in Canada, and then someone else in the UK in a different part as well. I think when you get to a stage where the business is, I was lucky. The word is bootstrap now. This didn't really exist then. And again, when you started an internet company back into the late 2000s, investment wasn't a thing as much as it is now. I think everyone assumes now to have a startup, you have to go and raise, $1 million, for example, and burn through that $1 million within a year. And then you have to raise $5 million. But actually back then, it was a case of, I was just very frugal with what I did. My first goal was, I need to make enough money to live off. And then it was, okay, right, now I've made enough money to live off. I need to make a bit more money so I can hire someone else. And then when I hired someone else, that was kind of when things changed, because rather than wearing all these different hats like sales, customer support, programmer, website developer, website designer, marketing, I could start thinking about, right, okay, well, what of these areas really am I best suited to do? And, focus on the bigger picture, which is obviously how to actually grow the business. So I think that's kind of the turning point really for when I look back at my career anyway.
So I'm glad you made that point because, for example, a person that has an idea and wants to start something, you really don't have to have $1 million or venture capital. I mean, you can start stuff even today in our situation that we're in worldwide right now. People can still have an idea and do something with it. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I agree. And particularly if there's lots of people who unfortunately have been furloughed or they're out of work. And, if you're sat around, unfortunately with not much to do at the moment, well, make sure you're putting that time to good use. There's the thing actually, interestingly, with Matchmaker, Dave. So we didn't spend time building Matchmaker initially. We put up a couple of forms on the podcast.co website. One was, hey, do you want to be a guest on podcast? Please fill out this form. And one was, if you got a podcast, you're looking for guests, please complete this form. And we monitored these forms over a period of a few months to see how many responses we were getting and kind of read through what people were saying. And before we actually started the development of the Matchmaker platform, because obviously as soon as you start development, that starts costing money, right? So you have to put a team on that, and if you don't know that it's going to work or there's no demand for it, well, that's an expensive mistake to make. So we validated the idea really very cheaply and very quickly, just using a couple of Google forms, which cost nothing to put up and probably 10 minutes to put together.
Exactly. Yeah, and you made a very valid point there as well, that we've got a lot of time to think. More than ever.
Oh, yeah.
We've been forced to slow down. And it's interesting. When I went to high school, I was not interested in history at all. That was taught by the high school basketball coach. It was so boring, so I ended up skipping school, which is another whole story, which we won't go into. But but now I absolutely love history, because if you go back and look at all the different periods in America and around the world where people had to adjust, had to think, and a lot of the most fantastic new ideas and products and services came out of times like this. There's an opportunity here for everybody, and I guess the key is, especially if you're going to do a podcast, is you want to identify what's the purpose, what's the point, as we're trying to zero in and narrow down and zero in on specifically entrepreneurship. That my mind goes in a different direction, so we could talk about 20 different topics, but that doesn't really work for this application. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, entrepreneurship is a very broad subject. So there are people who are, say, interested in, tech entrepreneurship. So starting, software as a service style businesses like I run. But then also there's people who are maybe interested in more entertainment, or even like food. For example, we've seen, I think the food industry, certainly here in the UK at the moment, is booming, and it's very exciting. Obviously, things have changed a little bit over the last few months, but the last sort of 2-3 years, it's changed significantly. And there's so many people who are entrepreneurs who are going into the food business, coming up with different concepts or bringing in different cuisines from around the world. So, think about, if you're going to start a podcast, think about who your target market is and who is going to be listening, and what are their kind of wants and needs, and what will they find interesting. I think you can be, as a podcaster, it's easy to be kind of quite a generalist, but I think kind of being a specialist will give you ability to get more cut through in a market that perhaps is not as competitive.
Right, and as you mentioned, the explosion of podcasts, the so many people, it's a place for them to have their voice.
Yeah,
like you said, in the food industry and specific areas where their expertise is a place to shine, really. And so, what would you want to tell our listeners today about? If they want to learn more about who you are, what you do, especially how they could possibly start their own podcast, what would you recommend?
Sure. Well, firstly, if anyone wants to connect with me and reach out, always happy to have a conversation. My social media channels are all listed on my website, which is jamesm.com/connect. So jamesm.com/connect. That'll come up with all my social media handles. If you're interested in starting a podcast, we've got a ton of resources over on podcast.co. We have 3 channels of content on there. So there's lots of content focused around, what equipment to buy, how to concept your show, how to get listeners to start listening to the podcast. And of course, as well, a great way of starting podcasting before you're actually launching your own podcast is to appear as a guest on other people. So check out matchmaker.fm because, again, that's a fantastic way to, connect with other people and kind of get some experience behind the microphone before you if you're not ready to sort of jump in completely, try and be a guest first, basically.
And I did a fair amount of research. You've got some great YouTube videos, and people can follow you on that channel as well, and kind of get a heads up on stuff. The other thing is, I have a confession to make. I actually have a microphone fetish. I like all different kinds of microphones, and I'm using one that does the job in terms of quality of sound. And would it be fair to say that there are a lot of options now, especially with USB microphones, that aren't going to cost, I shouldn't use the cliche an arm and a leg, but I just did. But there are options out there for somebody, like we're using the word bootstrapping, just starting from scratch and just taking the leap and getting going, moving forward. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm just like you. I also have like a microphone fetish. I love, we're really lucky because we get sent all sorts of equipment to review and use in videos. So it's great fun because sometimes you can spend ages looking at all the latest, greatest toys. However, like one of the things I would say is before people get too caught up in which equipment to buy, but ultimately getting started and just taking that first step is more important. But yes, you are right. There are lots of great options out there in terms of microphones. My advice is always it's worth investing. If you can spare $50 to $100, you can get a great sounding microphone. It's going to sound 10 times better than if you're using the built-in, microphone built into your computer or your laptop. So it is really worth the investment. And also as well, if you think about the number of podcasts that are being launched every month now, you've got to make sure that you're producing good quality content and it's got to stand out from the crowd, and that will help you do that.
Fantastic. I've been speaking with James Mulvany, the founder of Matchmaker.fm, not the other matchmaker, as well as podcast.co, some fantastic software options which were not available, just a few years ago, really, for anyone in any source. So we're so grateful for having you with us today, and the fact that you've come up with these services that obviously are catching hold, serving lots of people around the world and giving people a voice for their passion and purpose. So thank you for being with me today. Any closing comments on anything you'd like to say that you'd like us to remember, think about, or connect with you?
Well, I mean, just firstly, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity. This has been part of I'm doing 30 podcasts within 30 days, so it's quite a challenge. But yeah, just to sort of close off, I just say, like I said before, just start. If you're interested in starting a podcast, the first thing to do is actually just get behind a microphone, start recording and start putting out content. And you can worry about improving and iterating and making yourself better over time. But the sooner you can get started, the better ultimately.
Thank you very much for being with me. My guest today has been James Mulvany, a great serial entrepreneur and a real interesting guy. And so great to get to know you. Appreciate your time, James. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dave. Cheers.